Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, to wherever you're tuning in from. We have guests from all over the world today, so thank you for joining us. This is the third in our PPP webinar series, and today we'll be talking about the procurement process. So before I introduce our speakers, I just want to run through a couple of housekeeping points. We'll be recording today's webinar and posting it on the Cundall YouTube channel afterwards, as we do with all of our webinars. And also do submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll have some time to answer those at the end of the discussion. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's panelists. So first of all, we have Catherine Workman. So Catherine is a partner and head of the Middle East region for the law firm Pinsent Masons. Catherine's an expert in PPP projects, having worked in this field since 1995, and she has advised on all stakeholders on projects, including governments, sponsors and lenders on a variety of projects across Europe, the Middle East and Africa. So thanks for joining us, Catherine. And next we have Morgan Belcher. And Morgan is the Infrastructure Development and Economics Practice Lead at Mott MacDonald. He has 20 years of experience across a range of sectors, predominantly transportation and infrastructure. Morgan's currently the technical lead on 7 major multi-billion-dollar social infrastructure and accommodation PPPs in the UAE and KSA. And next we have Jim Lambrianidis, who's the project director for Plenary Group in Australia, a private sector business specializing in the design and construction and FM services delivery aspects of PPP projects. Jim has over 25 years of experience with both governments in the development of tender documentation for PPP projects, as well as extensive private sector expertise in the successful bidding and development of PPP projects. So then next up we have Cayman McCabe, who's a partner within Cundall based in our Melbourne office, also in Australia. So Cayman has over 30 years of consulting experience, engineering experience, and has gained extensive PPP experience both as a technical advisor and as well as part of a bids consortia. And then last but not least, we have our moderator today, Richard Stratton. And Richard is the partner and managing director of MENA at Cundall. In his 27 years at Cundall, Richard's gained extensive experience across PPPs, primarily in the healthcare sector. And with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Richard, to get started.
Thanks, Annabelle, and good morning, everybody. So I'm just going to make a slight adjustment to my screen. Thank you for joining and attending the webinar series, and I hope you find it interesting. And a special thank you to all of our panelists for participating. I think we'll have a good discussion. This is the third in our series, as Annabelle says, around PPP, and the focus of this is on the procurement process, essentially, strategies to challenging financial value and evaluating bid response. So it's very much in the context of PPP, which differs quite a lot from a traditional procurement process. So I'm going to just launch straight into asking the panelists some questions. If you have any questions, as Annabelle says, please use the Q&A chat, and what I will try and do is raise those questions as we go. So I'll be keeping an eye on those and dealing with them as we go, hopefully. So the first one I wanted to just talk a little bit was around the challenging of the public sector brief during the bid stage. So essentially, can the private sector bidder challenge the public sector's brief during the bid stage, and sort of focusing on how you engage effectively with the public sector, and also how you maintain confidentiality. And I was going to, Jim, I was going to ask you if you could open up the session by just giving your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, the government brief typically is a brief written by consultants and aligned to a particular thought as to how the public sector would operate a range of different procurement type methods, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a school or a prison. And it's basically on a footing that what they're currently doing and how they probably operate. Now, what the private sector brings is a fresh look at the brief and looking at problem solving in a more efficient way based on a range of different experiences. And so from our perspective, I don't think we've ever done a project where we actually haven't challenged the brief, provided some provoking thoughts and ideas to government to actually provide them a better way of doing things, and potentially whether it's in a hospital, whether it's in a school or a prison, we're always looking at how we can actually provide a better solution with a better value outcome for government. So I think from a private sector perspective, we're always looking at challenging the brief and coming up with an idea that potentially will win the bid because it actually meets the requirements or betters them, but also is more cost effective and gives us a much better footing in terms of overall cost.
And on that, Jim, how do you find, I mean, obviously your experience, I guess Australia is quite a mature market now, but in the early days, did you find it difficult, that engagement with the public sector client? I mean, did you find that they were as focused on the overall value, the life cycle benefits, or were they still a little bit tied to their experience of more traditional procurement?
No, I think the Australian market's always looked at what can be done better, and we're always of a mind to understand whether or not you challenge the brief, whether it was from a capital perspective in terms of a design solution that provided a better outcome that the state hadn't thought of, or whether it's from an FM perspective in terms of delivering the service at having a completely different approach, because typically in a PPP, taking the delivery from an FM service was probably something new. Traditionally, governments were using a break fix model, and really ran a lot of the infrastructure down. Whereas in a PPP, the infrastructure needs to be at peak capacity all the time. So there is no way in which you can actually run down, because you're committed to providing the performance requirements. So to that extent, there were always elements, whether it's on the build side or the FM side, to actually come up with solutions that were innovative and cost effective.
And I mean, touching on that last thing you said, the innovative bit, I mentioned maintaining confidentiality. I know, say, my experience of being involved in some PPPs, there was always a concern that you take the public sector brief and quite often you turn it on its head, because you want to come up with, as you mentioned already, a real value-based solution. And as you're engaging with the public sector, there's always certainly in my experience, there's quite often been a concern about how you maintain the confidentiality of your developing sort of solution or offering when you're actually in a bidding process. Have you found that a challenge, or?
Yeah, it has, Richard. It has on some projects. It has, and what we've found is that sometimes you'll end up with a completely different approach. As I said before, something that's innovative, that you go to a presentation with a bidder presentation, and the state government think that's a great idea, and you find out a week later that an amendment comes out incorporating your great idea, which is to some extent a great idea if you keep your mouth shut. But there are some areas where that does happen, because I think governments want trying to get the best out of all bidders, and coming out with a great idea to some extent potentially inhibits that being delivered. And from a private sector perspective, you're in a bit of a quandary whether or not you actually divulge that as part of an ITP or the interactive workshop, or whether you just keep it under wraps until such time as you actually provide the bid.
Sorry, on that, Richard, it's a very important one, because I suppose at the outset of a bid phase, there's a lot of discussion about what are the opportunities or the innovation that could be adopted by the bid, but invariably that gets followed by a conversation about whether how that will actually get captured by the bid, as to whether or not it's a discussion with the state or whether it's something you actually hold back and actually put into the bid as a response, protecting the bid, I suppose, from that risk of it being basically divulged to other parties. Because there's a fine line between, I suppose, having a good idea and having everybody else have it at the same time, basically, as Jim says.
Yeah. I mean, Morgan, you have act for the public sector, I think, quite a lot. I mean, how have you managed this, or how have you come across this issue?
Yeah, thanks, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what we were talking about on the previous webinar around the robustness of the brief. You know, that brief that you send out should be a reflection of the procurer requirements. You should have done your work as consultants in supporting the government to capture those requirements and to replay that to the market. We try and work on kind of elements of those procurer requirements that are fixed and those that are flexible, obviously to give that flexibility to the market, as Jim's described, to allow that innovation, to allow the flourishing of ideas through the design. Certainly, we obviously, when we run these tenders with our government clients, there are confidential queries that can be asked. But certainly, as Cayman says, it is difficult to justify or to reinforce the confidentiality. As you say, when a client sees a particular idea, they then want that put through other tenders. So yeah, you kind of have to hold your nerve a little and fight the corner almost for the bidder to remain confidential for some of those ideas, for sure.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Morgan, I was going to ask you to maybe lead on this one, but what do you think the focus of the tender response should be, and how do you sort of manage the balance between competing criteria? It kind of leads on a little bit from what I mentioned a moment ago. And so some of my experiences I'm drawing from a long time ago, when PPP started in the UK, mainly because PPP's still fairly young in the region. And it's how you manage the balance between the competing criteria of compliance, design, cost, future-proofing, all of those things.
Sure. Yeah. No. I think really there's two, as a project company, you kind of almost have two competing sets of criteria. There's obviously the client requirements, both a technical and a financial, which I'll talk about slightly more, and then obviously the competing requirements of your SPV members. So your FM contractor, your EPC contractor, your investor, they also bring with them a range of competing and often conflicting requirements that you obviously have, as the bid team, if you like, responding to the brief, have to navigate around. And I think, without stating the obvious, the evaluation criteria that are laid out in the RFP should provide guidance as to where the client is in terms of what really matters to them. Thankfully, we're seeing, I would say this is a technical consultant, but we are seeing higher weightings for technical scorings as opposed to financial. The days of maybe 50-50 technical financial hopefully are behind us now. Sort of 70-30 seems to be the norm, reflecting that that really reinforces the client's ambitions of receiving technically compliant, pushing the envelope on the technical front. But I suppose, yeah, so for submitting the bid, what should the tender focus on? Then there's obviously, as I just mentioned, procurer requirements. And these obviously that's the minimum, the baseline. Includes the facility functional requirements, the services and performance requirements. That's almost the baseline, as well as the overlying compliance with relevant laws, regulations. Then you've got to bring into this, on that baseline, the innovation, flexibility in design, adaptability, future-proofing, as you mentioned, Richard. And something we've seen most recently in some of our projects is looking at infrastructure epidemiology, obviously in relation to COVID, as well as flexible working. That's something that's being brought into our requirements, procure requirements, planning for the future. Certainly a big push now, whether it's asked for or not, around environmentally friendly, sustainable and healthier solutions for facilities. And it's no longer acceptable for a once, as soon as the building is complete, that's the sustainable credentials. It's now incremental growth over the life of the concession. And then the final one is the one that all clients like, and we as consultants like, which is this international best practice. How do you bring international best practice and overlay it with those different elements, which is obviously a challenge to demonstrate through the design and through your FM solution. And then I suppose on the flip side, on the financial side, really, it's about driving value for money. And one of the benefits, obviously, of PPP is allowing a much longer term life cycle review through whole life asset management principles, which allows bidders to take, as I say, a much longer view, balancing CapEx investment with operational expenditure over the life of the tender. So I think those are the kind of the competing elements, if you like, from sort of the client requirement perspective. If I hand over to Jim, I think you've got some thoughts on kind of that SPV competition.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. Yeah, I think from an SPV perspective, we're always looking at how best to actually put a bid together, and looking at the competing interests between CapEx and FM as well. And looking at it, there are two aspects from it, looking at it from a government side and looking at it from an SPV side. And typically where we've been in projects, depending on the capital value and whether or not the FM solution can actually provide you the headroom to actually improve your capital offering. Having worked on a project in Australia, working for government, the Commonwealth, on a defence project, I was a leader in terms of the D&C and the FM, and one of the things which was really apparent was we had two bidders who were pretty much on a par in terms of the D&C price, but when it came to the FM, it was a huge disparity between the two. And so when you looked at how they both operated, one basically took a straight line replacement strategy across the 25 years, whereas the other took a much more innovative approach to say that not every element of the building will be occupied 365 days of the year, and therefore took a much more lenient view towards, in terms of the replacement strategy. Instead of saying a 7-year replacement, some of them went 7 and then 8, 9 and 10 years. So that gave them a much bigger benefit in terms of the life cycle, but also the FM output, which gave them a much greater benefit overall in terms of looking at the pricing, and won them the job.
So, I mean, this is probably for the benefit of people that are attending the webinar that may not be as familiar with the PPP process. But because it includes everything, the design, FM operations, over a concession period that could be 25, 30 years. Can Jim, either Jim or Morgan, can you kind of put in perspective what the balance of the costs are? Because a lot of the time I feel that there tends to be very much a focus, as I mentioned earlier, on the design, and the design's really important, but it's almost like a design and build procurement rather than a full PPP procurement approach. So can you share what the typical proportional split on cost is likely to be?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, obviously it ranges between the asset groups. So solar, for example, has particularly high CapEx and low OpEx over the course of the concession. Social infrastructure, for example, hospitals, schools, typically we'd be looking at about a third for construction, commissioning and initial operations, and then 2/3 for the operational period. So 33 and 66 is the split. So rightly, as you say, when we're, again, as consultants writing the brief, big focus is what from clients, what does my facility look like? Not really worried about the functionality. Is there an efficient HVAC system, efficient MEP solution? It's more, what does the facade look like? Is there external artwork? Are people going to be impressed with my building? Again, which is, and again on PPP with output-based specification, we're trying to restrict, in some sense, the client interaction with that. That should be, you specify the main outputs for that building, private sector responds, and then kind of almost as a byproduct, the look and feel of the building will come together. But it'd be more fit for purpose, than maybe some of the buildings that we've seen in the past, big grand buildings that really aren't needed to be big grand buildings. And again, that's just driving not only efficiency through the OPEX to the CAPEX, but maintaining big opulent buildings with huge window spaces and big voids in this part of the world is particularly expensive. So if that's not needed, then again, that's one of the benefits that this process should deliver.
Yeah, so essentially poor design decisions that focus on CAPEX alone could have huge impact on the operational costs or even availability. So big risks to the private sector, but risks to the public sector as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Catherine, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I remember speaking to an operator of an airport actually, and said that the airport had this amazing design, lots of windows, lots of, and he said, well, us as operators, it's a bit of a nightmare because it's in the desert. All of that glass has got to be cleaned constantly. It's creating the big void spaces that Morgan's saying, it's creating more heat, which has got to be air conditioned. So our operational costs of air conditioning are going to go up, and operationally this is not a great design. So the two, I think, Jim, you were talking about the interfaces between the operational side and the D&C side, and marrying those together, that's definitely much needed. And then I interrupted you, so go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Catherine. I think in terms of most of the projects that we've worked on recently in terms of healthcare, not only have we looked at from an FM perspective, but we've looked at, for example, the hospital operator. And one of the key decisions that we've made is been looking at okay, we're spending a bit more capital up front, but that not only advantages the potentially FM, but also the hospital operator in terms of efficiencies. So, for example, if you had a particular design which wasn't as seamless between two different departments, which created additional nursing staff or additional portering staff, that impacts on the operator's ability to actually run that hospital for 25, 50 years. So when you do the analysis, the whole of life analysis, the issues are that potentially you spend a bit more, but from an operator potential, there's savings potentially of 15, 20% on the investment. So from an SPV, it's more about what value not only can we extract for the FM, but also for the operator itself, which gives us a bit of a leg up in terms of our submission back to government to say, not only are we cheaper, but we're actually providing you a much more effective and efficient solution that you're not going to have to fund additional staff for.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in there as well, I think it can be very easy for designers to fall into the trap of just focusing on the design, even just from a pure compliance perspective. And I suppose having been involved in projects where I suppose we've taken the sustainability lead, it's actually really important to actually look at it from an operational lens in the decision making, and actually challenge people to actually to think slightly differently. And if that means we need to challenge the brief better or more to get the better outcome, that's really important. That's the whole of project costing focus.
I think that's a really interesting point, Cayman, because when quite often we get a very robust brief. And you know, I'm talking from a design perspective. You know, quite often we get a very robust brief in terms of design criteria, you know, functional requirements and things like that. But the soft element of it that's very difficult to articulate in the brief is, what is that, you know, what's the impact of the design on the user, and how could we change it to improve the impact on the user? You know, I remember, you know what I mean. It's I've been involved in a couple of schemes where we're putting ourselves in the perspective of, say, if it was a hospital, the nursing staff, how many things that we design require nursing staff to perform a manual function that we could otherwise automate, so that they can give all of their attention to nursing only, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one, because I suppose my first foray into PPPs was the Royal Children's Hospital here in Melbourne, and we've been so fortunate enough to be involved in the master plan and feasibility stages. We were the only ones that actually said we'd stay with state. Everyone else ran off to bid teams. And what we tried to do is to translate the guidance and direction that we've been given by the users to what they wanted in a performance manner. So to give an example of that, is that one of the things they were very keen on was the idea that they had a park to the rear of the site, and they wanted to maintain connectability to that, particularly in the beds within the hospital. So we had to try and find a way of actually describing that in a fashion that I suppose gave them a design brief. So we set a performance indicator that said 70% of the beds needed to actually have a view to the park. Now, that essentially meant they couldn't do the classic, you know, 50% facing to the park and 50% facing to the street. They had to completely change that way of thinking. And it led to a design that actually, I suppose, inherently addressed the evidence-based design that was focused on daylight. I always remember getting a pat on the back from the architects who were involved when we did the kind of the project opening, to say they use that to actually continuously remind people that this is what they had to do from a design perspective, when there was a tendency to try and simplify, consolidate, and block stack the hospital, that this was something they had to achieve. So it's a real fine line between giving what I would say is direction and guidance without actually prescribing a solution, because you need to be mindful, if you prescribe things too much, you're actually hindering the innovation and different ways of thinking, basically, that could actually benefit the actual scheme design and operation, actually. So
okay. No, thanks for that. And it's kind of the segue you just created there, Cayman. I'm going to put you in the hot seat again around innovation. You used the word.
Yes.
So I'm going to punish you for it.
Yeah.
But again, it's another thing that springs to my mind quite often is when you look at PPP, and again, going back to one of the questions that was discussed earlier, one of the points that was discussed earlier around confidentiality and so on, and future-proofing, all of these things that are really important. You know, what are your thoughts on how innovation should be measured in a PPP procurement? So, you know, things around utility, demand, well, not demand itself, but, well, it is demand and its fluctuations and things around like the big issue at the moment, a very important matter is around zero carbon design, those sorts of things. I mean, how do you feel that design innovation can be measured?
In my mind, I think it's really important that the brief outlines the principles of innovation, the things that need to be addressed from an innovation perspective. So there should be guidance in the brief that at least directs people to what's really important for the project, so that there's prompts there from a design perspective, from an operational perspective, that actually you can leverage off, and that might be very simple things about talking about, you know, the issue of health and well-being. It could be the issue of net zero, as you say, which is potentially a combination of, it can be a simple one-liner that can basically say, as we've seen in some of the PPPs recently in Australia, where there needs to be a pathway towards to achieve a net zero outcome. Now, they're not telling you how to get there, but they're asking you to say, well, we want you to think about this, and we'd like you to come back to us as to how you think this should be actually addressed. So it's not necessarily about providing the nuts and bolts of, you know, here's the items you need a tick box to actually get there. It's about more the principles that you need to go through. There's also really important to actually put a bit of weight of importance to that innovation. Although I would highlight the fact that the public sector comparator number for briefs invariably isn't the same. If you actually built the same piece of social infrastructure from a government perspective, you probably wouldn't actually deliver the brief that you're asking to. So you need to be mindful of the fact that sometimes the brief is already pushing the boundaries, and it's not necessarily just to add to it. I've also found that one of the areas that has been, I suppose, increasingly focused on is that operational cost side of things. That's become a real important factor. So providing people with the guidance on what are the cost parameters you should be using to actually assess the evaluation of things helps the designers to look at things from a whole of the project perspective, not just the capital cost, but looking at the operational cost. So you actually start to get a real understanding of the fact that, you know, you might find that with the increasing cost of gas, that gas doesn't make sense to actually go through from a whole of life perspective. And then you have an issue of saying, that's great from a cost perspective, how do we manage the carbon impact of that over time? So you actually start to change the way you're thinking that moves forward. So we're starting to see things that are focusing on the electrification or the potential future electrification of buildings so that these things can happen as the grid gets greener. So it's I suppose in summary, it's about giving the bidders an inkling or guidance as to what's important that they should focus on from an innovation perspective, and give them some prompts that allow them to leverage off it from there.
Okay, don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
Well, in terms of innovation, we've always looked at innovation of what can we provide the operator that's more than what they've currently got. And in most projects, we know that over time, there's an expansion of the services they provide. Potentially there's other private sector or government bodies that want, because it becomes like a bit of an incubator, whether it's a hospital or whether it's a research facility. So what we've continually done is look at the potential for future growth, and actually build that future growth into our base build. And so equity from an SPV perspective actually takes the risk of being able to build that, and also takes the risk of being able to tenant that out at some point in the future. When you look at our bid for the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre, we built in potentially an extra 5,000 square metres of floor area, and we took the risk that we would take that we would tenant that out at some point in the future. We had government basically take up all that space prior to the hospital opening, and to that extent, the last aspects of that are now being fitted out for their use. So again, it's looking at not only innovation from a hospital operation or research centre operation, it's what else can they use that space for, to expand or to actually bring other like-minded companies into the building to create a hub of excellence.
Okay, it's interesting. And you said something there, you know, that you touched on that space provision, Jim, and trying to plan a little bit ahead for the future. It just made me, it just kind of made me think a little bit, and I don't know whether Morgan, you might have mentioned it earlier on, was around everything we've gone through during the COVID recently, and the impact that's had on a lot of, you know, social infrastructure facilities, you know, like say schools, you know, are schools too big now? And if they're too big, what else can they be used for? Are hospitals flexible enough? Because COVID, for example, has put huge pressure on hospital facilities where, you know, some ward areas have been given over to COVID treatment rather than what they were originally designed for. I mean, do you see, are you seeing that coming out in through the procurement processes on any recent bids that you've been looking at?
Yeah, for sure. So I think tenders in the market, the procurers have taken a view, let's just continue with what was specified previously, specifically in hospitals, because, you know, arguably those are already, you know, sanitized areas. They already have the facilities to deal with, you know, different loadings, depending on patients, etc. Certainly, I think, as I mentioned, for new facilities, maybe some accommodation PPPs that we've been looking at in Saudi, there is certainly a need for looking at, as I say, infrastructure epidemiology, just building that into the design process, such that in the future that's there and flexible. And similarly, yeah, the kind of working from home or just a different style of working, again, back to adaptable buildings. And from a non-engineering perspective, that's, you know, the ability to move walls around potentially, to change spaces, you know, potentially, obviously, with MEP issues around that, but being able to reconfigure spaces to suit need, I think, is certainly something that we're seeing procurers ask for more and more. I think just going back to something that Cayman as well started and Jim built on, I think something we're certainly seeing on an innovation front is not so much pressure, but an opportunity offered by lenders for more innovative solutions around sustainability. So pushing the kind of ESG, the 17 UN principles. We're seeing now gradually the financial world almost catching up. And now, you know, we're seeing more and more in Abu Dhabi with some of our clients that actually they can borrow money slightly cheaper if they're being seen to be pushing sustainable solutions, so that they really are. It's not just a reporting mechanism anymore, but like the Equator principles were for lenders. This is, you know, a much more engaged process. And as I say, there are, you know, potential upsides on the lending rates for developers and investors to push this, you know, this ESG agenda. So not only are clients requesting it, people like yourselves at Cundall designing it in, but also lenders are now pushing that through the process as well. So there's a kind of a trifecta of innovation to try and make these buildings. As I say, it's not just about being environmentally sustainable, it's healthier buildings for the inhabitants as well. I think Jim mentioned earlier about the users as well, you know, a much better working environment for people. Again, maybe not, you can't quantify that, but procurers, NHS, hospital authorities want that for their workers for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's got to be very attractive when it comes to the overall cost. You know, the cost of finance is a not an insignificant factor when you're looking at facilities, is it?
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So on that, again, I'm trying to create these links. Catherine, from one of the areas, you know, that's considered, obviously, it's a hugely, well, it probably ends up being one of the most important things in the final decision making of a PPP, is that ultimate unitary payment. You know, what does that look like? And it was, you know, just to really explore what the key areas that affect the unitary payment are from your experience.
Yeah, sure. So maybe if I take a wee bit of a step back as well, just as to what that unitary payment means. So, and what I might do, we've just had some discussions about social infrastructure, because obviously here in this region, power related projects have slightly dominated. So I'm going to maybe move towards slightly more social infrastructure, just because they're becoming more prevalent in the region. So that contract structure is quite relevant, obviously, to the economics of the project. We've heard the term concession today, and actually availability. So you think there are availability-based projects, concession projects, and those availability projects are so-called, I don't know if, certainly is in my memory, some 25 or 6 years ago, as the payment mechanism effectively related to the availability of the asset. And and certainly when we were doing Dartford Hospital back in 1995, out came something called FRS 5. And when we were looking at what we were calling our payment mechanism at the time, it was important for the private sector to demonstrate that the asset was on their balance sheet. And one way to demonstrate that was that the private sector was taking a risk of the performance of the asset. And as the payment was variable depending upon that availability. So from my recollection, that was kind of where that was born. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And then for a concession, for a project is largely where the private sector is granted rights to exploit an asset. They can collect the revenues generated from that exploitation, and then they pay the public sector a percentage of the revenues as a concession fee. So you've kind of got payments going in different directions. But if you're talking about a unitary payment going from the public sector to the private sector, that will largely be an availability-based payment, of which there are kind of two elements. There's the availability payment and something that we have featured today about the service payment. And that availability element is largely used to repay debt, and largely equates to the upfront cost of the construction. It's generally a set amount for the entire term, subject to indexation. There may be some other instances where that amount could change during the term if there's a change in law, or if there is a variation, which nobody likes doing, or just a compensation event. Although I think depending on different jurisdictions, I've seen in a number of jurisdictions a reluctance on the public sector side to increase payments to cover these points, and tend to lean towards just extending the contract period to compensate for something, you know, they've been in breach of their obligations. That's not a great position to be in. I mean, in Eastern Europe, I've seen it described as, well, we'll only pay you if we get budget for it from the central government. So, okay, so the private sector is never going to get paid then for building a whole new wing to the hospital. So that's not great. Lenders are in a difficult position at that point if you extend the term, because you're back-ending the investment. So you've got the sponsors who are going to take the cash flow strain immediately. The lenders aren't going to get anything apart from seeing that their sponsors are under a bit of a cash stress. So there's quite a lot around those key features for that. And then the service payments, which we greatly rightly have focused on today, because I completely agree there is a tendency to forget that element, and that's largely split into hard and soft facilities management. Soft being kind of cleaning, or if you're in a hospital, portering or catering services, and then you've got the hard FM that really is that planned reactive day-to-day maintenance, but as Jim was talking about earlier on, and Morgan too, that kind of ongoing life cycle maintenance. And I think the comment earlier on about that, how that is calculated, is really interesting, because I know for sure 25 years ago when we were looking at that, somebody would just go, well, it's just a percentage of the initial capex, so we'll put that figure into the model. Whether or not that actually represented, and quite clearly couldn't have represented, what was a proper life cycle maintenance. So it's nice to see that today, in these days, there's a slightly more academic and systemic approach to calculating what that means. So then for those services, they both, so for the soft FM, you'll largely find that those prices will stay the way they are for 5 years and then tend to be market tested. Hard FM tends to stay with the same service provider because it's so, well, was deemed so integral to the original proposition, but they would be benchmarked just to make sure that they do fit in with the prices. They're all variable as well, and again subject to performance monitoring for those key performance indicators, just to make sure that particularly on the hard FM, that the asset is still sticking with the private sector, and that they can take the risk on its performance. So those systems. I could stop there because I've rambled.
Oh, that's interesting.
Potted history into what is the unitary payment, but yeah, somebody else might have views as well.
I don't know if anybody wants to add to what Catherine said. I've got a question, but I can ask it afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I can just add. I suppose it's as consultants, when we're structuring these transactions, you're right, Catherine, in terms of ensuring that there is a smooth and clearly demonstrable path from KPIs that we set through to potentially availability or unitary charge deductions, maybe less so bonuses, but ensuring that in a particular hospital, for example, any number of elements within a hospital room can cause that to be unavailable. The machinery might not work, the lights might not come on, the aircon is not pumping out at 22.5 degrees, whatever the set standard is. So it's ensuring that there is this clear transition from KPIs through to unavailability through the payment mechanism. But I think the ability of project company to not quite game the system, but be clever in terms of recognizing the weightings around some of those availability targets. They'll obviously put more effort into higher weighted, higher penalties that might come through. But certainly, as you say, that there is that baseline that helps to repay the capex that really shouldn't be affected, and then this fluctuating payment. As I say, typically deductions that we see in region, but in maybe in more mature markets, I'm sure Jim came and you've seen sort of bonuses around some of the availability payments. I suspect, as I say, in some of those higher weighted areas. I don't know, guys, if you've seen bonuses in this respect.
Not normally in Australia. They haven't really been a feature of bonuses at all. It's just been the big stick.
Well, you've addressed, I think, the thing I was going to touch on anyway, Morgan, which was about the availability. And again, this, for people that are familiar with PPP, I think it all makes a lot of sense. But I guess for people that aren't familiar with PPP, it's the fact that, you might design something, let's be, without going into detail, you might design something that's very cheap, but not very reliable. And if it's not very reliable, and space in an asset, whether it be a school or a hospital or anything, isn't available to the public sector to use, then there's penalties, which means the private sector then don't receive their monthly payment in full. And therefore, potentially the private sector entity, the project company could go bankrupt because of that, and that's why it's so important that it just simply passing that burden, or so I think there may be a view that well, that's the private sector's risk, but it's the public sector's risk if the private sector entity goes bankrupt. So it was really just understanding those balances, so people kind of, at every stage of the job, these competing criteria, the balance of them, the engagement of all the key people, as well as engaging with the public sector along the way, is really important.
Yeah, I mean, just first, sorry, Jim, go ahead.
I was going to say, Richard, no, that's true in terms of the private sector being at risk. That realistically, the public sector has a much bigger loss that it takes where things do go wrong with the private sector, and they have to then front front the electorate to say that things have gone wrong, and it's not about sometimes the process, but again, the public sector trying to extract too much value from a project, and that becomes fairly difficult when the private sector has to deliver a project when it's actually losing money.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Sorry, Cayman, you were going to add something as well.
This gets very interesting depending on how formulaic or so extreme you get with the briefing, because if you describe how an asset is going to be used, then there's an element of risk that both parties are taking in terms of, if it's not used the way it's intended, who pays the impact. So it becomes quite interesting, particularly when you've got performance requirements imposed. So if you sit down and say you must achieve a certain energy target or a greenhouse target, then there has to be guidance and assumptions that have to be made about how the asset is used. If that's not used the way it's either was briefed, or then how does that get rectified? How do you judge whether performance has been achieved or not? So there needs to be that kind of recognition that, with all the best will in the world, you can't absolutely define how an asset is going to be used. So, and you're going to have to recognize that there's going to be a working relationship that needs to be there, and one that you basically were being, I suppose, mutually beneficial and respectful, so you don't actually get kind of lawyers at 10 paces. You actually work together to achieve the outcome, because hospitals, are being used very, very differently than they would have been used 2 years ago. Even prisons are being used quite differently for different reasons. So you just have to recognize that operationally things will change, and it's just a fact of life.
Yeah, something somebody said just triggered another thought, and I'm probably throwing in stuff here that's quite complex, but again, it's maybe more for the audience, just so that people understand the complexities that can exist in the procurement of a PPP. Maybe some of these haven't been experienced so much, or maybe this particular point I'm going to raise hasn't yet surfaced its head in the region. I'm not entirely sure, but certainly when I've been involved in some schemes, where the PPP project might be an expansion to an existing facility, again, I'm talking social infrastructure here. Again, let's say hospitals are usually a good example of this, because they require a lot of maintenance, where the hospital itself already has a full maintenance team. And then you're going to build a facility where the private sector is going to build and essentially maintain that. And there's this requirement sometimes to transfer staff from the public sector maintenance team to the private sector team in order to ensure that people don't lose their jobs. I don't know who to actually direct that one at, but has anybody come across that being considered in any Middle East projects yet?
We've certainly come across the people transfer element. And that is, as public services transfer to private, and certainly Saudi in particular is looking increasingly rigorously at that, and potential loss of employment for Saudi nationals. Don't think we've looked at an expansion per se. I think racking my brain, can't think of one. I think they typically in region, given social infra is fairly new, they don't want to add that extra layer of interface complication. I mean, the Dubai Health Authority, for example, the Cardiology Centre of Excellence, the 120-bed facility, that is within the Rashid site, a plot within the Rashid site, potential to connect, the pipes, utilities into existing networks, etc., and obviously manage the integration within the wider hospital facility. But certainly on that one, at least, not a transfer of staff.
Okay.
I think, I think the issues would be the same as if you took over staff on day one, as if you would take over staff on an expansion, and there is always a massive issue on that way in which that transfer of staff happens. And I'm sure Jim has experienced this himself, of taking on quite a few. I mean, in the first instance for the Middle East, that the Ization programs, Saudiization, Omanization, Kuwaitization, all of those have been deliberately to create that upskilling. And I know Kuwait were very bold and upfront in at the beginning of their program, although it didn't go too far, that it wasn't about not having enough money to build these assets. It was about upskilling the workforce and giving people jobs and skilled work. So I think the purpose as within the Middle East is certainly there to give that approach. And I mean, the transfer, normally, you know, the due diligence stage during the procurement process of having information about the workforce, the age of the workforce, the skills of the workforce, and the role that they've been done. But that is one of the purposes of a PPP, is that upskilling and is that transfer of information and managing and using the skills of the private sector who have been doing this for a number of years to take a body of people and incorporate them into a private commercial environment. So it's one of the benefits of a PPP, is that exact transfer. And I know it's difficult, certainly in Cyprus, when I was doing some of the projects there, the airports and the ports, of the transfer of those staff. Generally in the private sector, public sector, there were far too many for the role. I remember having a conversation at the port project where I described, which is in Europe, the Acquired Rights Directive, which is TUPE to British people, it's what it was called. You transferred everybody across. But what was quite interesting is, once I was saying, and don't worry, your jobs will be protected, the response I got back from the head of the Port Authority was, well, what are you talking about? We have a job for life. So there was no benefit to him that there would be protection for employees' rights by the move. Also, the different types of approaches, quite often those transfer occurs, the mechanics, and I'm being a typical lawyer here, the mechanics of the transfer is quite interesting. So in some jurisdictions, the transfer occurs automatically at midnight because the undertaking has moved, so the company and the business has moved to somebody else. Whereas it was a great shock to us on Zagreb Airport when we realized that in Croatia, it didn't move with the undertaking, it moved with the contracts. So because you had a PPP agreement from the public sector to the private sector, SPV, and then from the SPV to the operator, you found that you had two sets of transfers. So rather than going straight to the operator, you had two sets of transfers, which was a total nightmare because you had to register each transfer with the Ministry of Labour twice. And so what you were hoping at 1 minute past midnight that you had a whole workforce, you didn't, because you had to then go through a two-stage process for moving them. But so that's a slight expansion on your point, but it does impact upon your procurement process, how you do your bid, how you accommodate those people within your bid process, how you assimilate them in your due diligence that you do on those people which will come for this region for sure. Yeah. Sorry, Jim, you might have a view.
Yeah, I think just quickly, I think all those are valid points, Catherine. I think the issue potentially is where you come into a brownfield site and you expand the workforce and you take on existing personnel, but then you also bring in new personnel. And to some extent, as we all know, the private sector rates are somewhat different to what the public sector rates are. And there is potentially an issue between different pay rates depending on how they're employed in the within the people doing the same job having a completely different rate, and that to some extent creates tension between employees as they come into the workforce providing the same service.
Yeah, I feel like I may have opened a can of worms with this one, but maybe it's a subject for the future as things evolve here. But no, thanks for that. So kind of moving, well, in a slightly different direction, but the thing that comes up quite frequently, or I hear quite frequently, is around utility consumption, I'll call it. So that's, you know, the amount of water that's used in a project over the life of a project, the amount of energy, you know, power, whatever other energy, whether it's district cooling, those sorts of tariffable utilities. Jim, I was going to just ask you from your experience, how are utility consumption fluctuations, not tariff now, because normally that risk is picked up by the public sector, but in terms of the actual consumption of utilities, energy, water, and so on, how are fluctuations dealt with?
Well, from an Australian point of view, our initial projects 10 to 15 years ago tried to provide the private sector with taking both demand and tariff risk. But there was a significant pushback in terms of cost, risk, benefit. I think went through the process, and government just thought that was not an appropriate solution to go forward. And then we moved from, as you just said, Richard, to a demand-based model where private sector took volume risk on those utilities. But that also became problematic because as working, whether it's a hospital or research centre or whatever, it's the users that potentially have the ability to turn on off lights or turn off taps, and so again the cost risk benefit became far outweighed, and to that extent I think most of our PPP projects really don't have any demand or tariff risks on any of the utilities anymore, because it just wasn't economic for government to go down that path.
For me, from an innovation perspective, Rich, this is really an interesting one for me, because particularly with this drive for net zero, if you're going to take some, so there's a real opportunity to actually get it being open to tariff risk, or at least providing a mechanism by which the bidders can actually think about it and consider it. Because increasingly what you're finding now is the utility companies are getting quite protective about how they charge for the energy that you use. I know in Australia they're very good at keeping the charge per kilowatt hour down low, but hitting you hard with the maximum demand. And therefore it's all about actually load shifting. But if there's no economic benefit to the bidder to load shift, then they won't. So if you're wanting to actually get people to think a little bit differently, and Jim knows where I'm coming from here with the good old chill water storage and other systems that actually allowed you to move forward, it's unless you have a mechanism by which the bidder gets financial advantage of doing that, then it's not going to be entertained from a bid design perspective. Yet it could actually be a really smart solution from a whole of life or a whole of project perspective. So I think this is an area where I think people will need to get their heads around as to how they can actually work through that the utility cost structures that are there to find mechanisms which the bidders take educated and informed at risk, as they're already doing, but in terms of utility costs.
That's also, Cayman, your point's very valid, because in essence it becomes a treasury or an exchequer in the UK taking a point of view as to what the benefits are, whereas typically they're very structured in their vision in terms of blinkered as to what the project is, and they won't look outside that, what potential benefits some of those things might have in the longer term.
So that, I mean, I guess, you know, you touched on it earlier, I think, Cayman, that's where I guess it's important that the output specifications or the RFP for the PPP gives enough emphasis on innovation and how innovation and future proofing can be assessed.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, and it's a difficult one because in some instances, you know, some of the innovation is evidence-based. So as Morgan basically highlighted, the whole health and well-being. If I had a financial mechanism where I could guarantee 2% productivity increases, then sustainability would be a dead duck, because essentially sustainability would be the key focus of every project if I could ensure that, but I can't. So it's more about actually capturing the elements that actually lead to a better outcome from an operational perspective, from a health and well-being perspective, and embedding that in a way that actually encourages bids to sort of address that in an evidence-based manner.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. So we're sort of coming towards the end of the session, and considering everything that we've been discussing this morning, Catherine, I was going to get you to maybe lead on this one, or start it off anyway. But in the context of everything we've discussed, what do you think drives the evaluation process of a PPP bid? So the private sector submits their bid. What do you think then drives the evaluation process?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose over the years, I've probably seen maybe about 50 different ways of evaluating bids, and we've all seen lots of different approaches. I think there are a number of considerations. I mean, I've seen ranging from one criteria being evaluated, which is the price, which, other than in very limited circumstances, I don't think is a very good thing. And I largely say that because you're really undermining the benefits of a PPP, of just looking at the lowest price, or frankly, in the case of a concession, the highest percentage of revenues, which somebody reminded me the other day, 50% of zero is still zero. So you might congratulate yourself that you've managed to get, 50% of the revenues, but if those revenues are low and you haven't taken account as to the business plan that comes with that, then you're not really going to get very far. And that undermining of the benefits, for me, is the benefit of a PPP is to give you a quality of construction and services delivery on time and on budget, and a race to the bottom on price is without a doubt going to chip away at that quality and efficiency. I think I've also seen tender documents issue a non-negotiable contract and just say, here you are bidders, just submit a price and take it or leave it. So again, you're down to price again, not a great idea. And that doesn't help anyone, because normally what then happens is that contract that is non-negotiable is also unbankable, and then leads to long delays later when elements have to be renegotiated. I mean, on Zagreb Airport, which I've mentioned before that I did, that approach was taken, and 3 years later, we finally got to financial close with a whole new concession agreement that had been signed immediately. And what didn't really help the public sector is that they had, by that point, they'd lost all their bargaining power, and they'd missed the opportunity to use the procurement process to create that competitive tension to get the best deal. So I suppose some people might have heard of a common approach to an evaluation on the basis of, quite often, tender documents are described as will be picked on the most economically advantageous tender, which is meet, and that isn't the lowest price overall, but it is the lowest price to meet certain standards of quality and risk allocation. So in my view, what you're looking for and what you're driving, so finally answer your question, is a preferred bidder or a partner who can deliver that scope of work for the price quoted, taking the risks that they've been passed, and that those can be managed and it's all investable, so that from a bank and an equity perspective, people can stand behind it. So those for me are the things that will drive a good evaluation process rather than just getting the cheapest price. So hopefully that's kicked off some sparks and thoughts in others.
Yeah, I mean, something maybe I could bring that links back into a question we talked about earlier around confidentiality. I mean, I've seen, and certainly will see in the future, procurers with their consultant team being able to almost cherry pick parts of certain bids to use as commercial leverage for maybe a round of BAFOs, and also for benchmarking. If you've got 4 bids, you benchmark a construction cost, particular elements, any bids that are slightly out of kilter. That gives you as the procurer a bit of leverage to go back and squeeze price or gains or competitive advantage. So that's certainly something we see towards the back end of the evaluation process. Once you kind of know the good bits of all the bids, you can then use that potentially to leverage a bit more value and commercial advantageous position that Catherine identifies through that process. And then run that kind of best and final offer type, the BAFO type arrangement, as I say, to really drive value from all of those bids into your preferred bidder. Frustrating for bidders, but them's the beats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the really important word that Catherine used there is actually somebody you can partnership with. I think that's actually, from my mind, it's you need to look at this is not just a single transaction. This is going to go on for a long time. So you need to look at it in that context of is the bid team and the people that are being put forward and the partners that are in that team people you want a partnership with. Because that's going to be very important, because ultimately you have to translate your brief into a design that delivers. Now it will change between where the bid gets lodged to when it actually gets delivered. So you need to work with that group and not have a solid and strong working relationship that delivers on the outcome.
Yeah, I think Cayman, that's a really good point, because Catherine mentioned about the evaluation, the hard-nosed evaluation of the tender. That from an SPV perspective, with the interactive workshops that we have with government, we think the evaluation starts almost there, because ultimately it's sitting with government, going through your proposed design solution, or whether it's an FM solution. And hearing what they've got to say in terms of the feedback, responding to that feedback, and actually coming back and saying, yeah, we listened, we understand where you're coming from, and this is what we've done. So ultimately what that does is put you in a position where, as you say, Cayman, the ability of the government to turn around and say, yeah, we can work with these guys, they understand where we're coming from. And gives them some comfort that whether in terms of the proposal being the best proposal, in terms of the team being able to listen and able to work with them over the next 3 or 4 years to construction, but then working through the next 25, 30 years as part of a team to actually deliver the project through the operational phase.
Albeit having been on the technical advisor side, you are actually told not to show any emotional connection to any proposal because of probity and everything else. So you can't be showing any preferences as such, but so it tends to be more focused. But I agree with you, at the end of the day, those presentations tend to actually allow that opportunity of getting that first interaction that is very important in terms of the bid evaluation.
Correct. Yeah, I think working on one bid where we went through the tea break and looking at the plans, and one of the government team turned around and said, this is fantastic, we could actually, if we did this, that, and then we could almost replicate what we've currently got. He was taken to the door and thrown out.
I think another point as well, we keep talking about innovation. That's not just in the solution, that's actually in your design submission and your bid submission. Seeing people submit iPads as part of bid submissions, that when you open up, push a button and the exec summary is an introduction by the project director with a graphical fly through, that innovation, just as you say, Cayman, you can't let that cloud your judgment, but it does just shows that people have given that extra thought. For you as an evaluator, they're spoon feeding you what you need to see, what you need to hear to score them well.
You do tend to find though that every time the brief gets refined, that the thing that worked last time in the bid gets added as a requirement. So it used to be a fly through was something amazing, and now it's a precondition. So it does add extra layers every time for the bid, basically. So
before that came in, it was a static model.
Yeah.
And then now we've gone to the animated movie.
That's it. Right, so I'm just conscious of time, and I've got a last question, which is the $1 million question maybe, but I'm going to start with Morgan, and maybe just everybody just say what they think. But because I've heard a lot of conflicting views you hear in the market, but is a PPP procurement strategy more cost effective than a traditional procurement strategy? Over to you, Morgan, to start it off.
So I'll go back to my MBA days, and I'll say it depends. No, it's not. Certainly in region, in the GCC, it's not as simple as just looking at cost. PPP is being used as a lever, as Catherine identified, in the power sector, for example, and water sector over the last 30 years, as a way of ensuring in the UAE and Qatar that the lights stay on, that the water is running, that the aircon is available, to drive sort of macroeconomic industrial growth, logistical growth. Dubai as a logistical hub would not be where it is without reliable utilities. More recently, in the last kind of 15 years, there has been a recognition of dwindling oil reserves, the need to reduce reliance as the state as a provider of all public services, and certainly in the better use of government resources, and that has now manifested with the young population and the need to provide longer term employment outside of the public sector for nationals in this new wave of social infrastructure. So trying to move public services from the public sector into the private sector to generate different parts of, as I say, of the market, the private sector market, that will allow sort of longer term employment for nationals. So that's certainly kind of at the big picture level, which maybe you might not take into account if you're doing a kind of a project to project VFM analysis. There's then also certainly other areas, intangible areas, and schools are always a good example. That learning environment. How do you quantify the benefits of a well-maintained, well-designed school and that learning environment for children? In Kuwait, for example, we were working, and we failed to demonstrate to the Minister of Education the benefits. So when he looked on a pure cost basis over the life of the project of PPP versus his traditional procurement was a lot lower, because they didn't spend as much on the school in the capex, they didn't spend as much on the opex, but that was having a detrimental impact on the results that the Kuwaiti children were receiving. So I think you can't just look at it on a cost basis, and PPP certainly should not just be this elixir for funding constraints that governments have. That it's a much more complex element that brings benefits. Certainly on a project by project basis, you need to demonstrate VFM through risk transfer, but there should be other considerations. And we're seeing now in social infrastructure, the likes of National Centre for Privatisation, ADIO in Abu Dhabi, they are certainly recognising those additional benefits, and that's now part of the wider business case that's accepted.
Okay. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that.
From my perspective, I'll probably say yes, if you look at things in a true like for like basis, and that's the key. It's the true like for like. So what, like Morgan said, is when you look at it from the maintenance perspective and the upkeep and everything else, if you maintain the same level of standard that you're asking for in the brief, then yes, the PPPs can actually deliver a more effective product, a better product that can actually be cheaper too. I think it's really important, as Morgan said, that you look at it from a context of challenge. It's an opportunity to challenge things. So we've seen on a number of projects here in Victoria, where I am based in Australia, that the state government has used the PPPs to actually change how facilities are actually designed. So prisons being a perfect example, where there was a formulaic response. They used the PPP to change that thinking, and they've ended up with better products that are actually being able to replicate, etc. So it's about the challenge and benefits that you need to do. I don't think it's a panacea. I don't think it's suitable for everything. I think you need to be mindful of. I think as the UK did, it went down to smaller and smaller and smaller projects, where the return starts to get very, very difficult to genuinely manage. So you have to be a little bit careful about where it's used, but go into that and actually understand that it can actually give you value, and it should be considered for the right projects.
I'll take a bit of a different tack in the sense of looking at what PPP does and how it actually provides more than just a facility. It provides a service to the public. If we take, for example, a hospital, the hospital is well maintained compared to, say, some of the other public facilities that aren't. I remember working on a hospital project, PPP, and having to go down to the public hospital where the head office network was, and walking through the hospital with carpet which was ripped, taped over, and yet that's acceptable. But in a PPP, that seemed to be an abatement riddled approach. And so I think to that extent, what that does is also provide a facility that's kept up to date, kept modern in terms of, and that has an impact in terms of staff wanting to go to work in a facility that's continuously looked after, as well as looking at, say, patients that knowing that their rooms and their facilities are always modern, fresh, and provides the amenity they need. So that's taking a different view in terms of just looking at it from a cost perspective, but looking at it from a human perspective as to how that actually impacts people's lives as well as their workplace.
Yeah. I was going to add, although I'm going to seem mercenary in comparison to Jim's lovely human approach, so I'm going to wish I'd got in before Jim, because this is a much nicer way to end. But I suppose I was going to say the same as, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I was going to say the same as start, the same as Cayman is yes, if. And I think it's yes, and I'll be a boring lawyer now, of if structured correctly. So, you know, the benefits I've spoken before about a PPP structure and that quality of construction and delivery on time and to budget were, you know, one of the reasons to start all of this. And I think that there are mechanisms. It's a very complex matrix and a very orchestrated matrix that, you know, once there is bits all over hundreds of documents, that once the jigsaw puzzle is there and you keep the jigsaw puzzle the way it should be, then there are a lot of benefits. You using lenders to do your work for you as a public sector entity by not paying the availability payment until construction's finished, or for them to ensure that the quality through the milestones of payment of construction are there, I think it's a pretty genius idea to kind of get them involved. So but if you start to unpick any of those or undermine, as I used this word earlier, you lose those benefits. So if you start playing around the edges or put jigsaw pieces, puzzle pieces in the wrong place, then it does fall apart. So you've got to be quite careful about keeping the delicate balance between all of the parties to make sure you get the benefits from it. But I agree with Jim, from a human perspective, you're definitely getting, and when we were doing hospitals in the UK in the early 90s, I went to Greenwich Hospital, which was the second one that I did, and the backlog maintenance on that project was something like £60 million, and the brand new hospital was 100 million. It was, when you did the value for money analysis and the do nothing analysis, the do nothing was pretty expensive option, and therefore gave the people of Greenwich a much nicer facility to take their to be treated in. So I'm trying to be human as well, rather than a boring lawyer.
No, I think that's it. Yeah, that's, I think, my view. I concur with everybody else from my experience. It's there's lots of benefits to it, and it isn't. I don't think personally. I don't think it's more expensive if you evaluate your traditional scheme in exactly the same way that you evaluate the PPP scheme. But I think we've reached the end. Surprisingly, we've had no questions, and I don't know whether that's because we've been so good at answering all of the questions, or you, the panelists, have, or whether we've just confused everybody. I'm not sure, but if anybody on the call, anybody that's attending, does have questions that you want to ask, do feel free to send them through, and we'll get answers back to you. But I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank everybody that attended, and especially thank our wonderful presenters for giving their insights on the procurement process from a PPP perspective. And Annabelle, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think that's everything. Obviously, you've covered a lot today. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the session's recorded, and in the next couple of days, will be up on the Cundall YouTube channel. So that's it. Yeah, thanks again to all of our panelists. Have a good day.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye.